good afternoon to those in Europe, Africa, and good evening or good night to those in the Asia Pacific region, and good morning to those in the Americas. This month we have another webinar on African renewable ammonia projects, and this time we specifically focus on Egypt. Before we move further with this webinar, we mentioned that this session is recorded, and that means that in a few days the recording of this webinar will be placed on our YouTube channel, so the YouTube channel of the Ammonia Energy Association. Also, we will write an article on the website ammoniaenergy.org, and if you have any questions for the speakers during the session, feel free to send any questions to the speakers in the chat. So today I'm joined by Alzbeta Klein from the International Fertilizer Association and Tarek Hosny from Fertiglobe. Next slide, please, Julian. And as already mentioned in the previous session in November, we have a trilogy of African projects. So first we focus on Mauritania in October 2022. Then we focus more on the sub-Saharan Africa projects more in the eastern side of Africa. And now we specifically focus on Egypt. And what you see here is an overview of all the webinars we have done within this webinar series. And as you can see, the main focus has been on North America so far, Europe and Africa, which means that in 2023, we will make sure that we also focus on some other continents. So we will make sure that we cover the entire globe with our webinar series. Next slide, please, Julian. So why Egypt? Well, the first reason for that is, of course, that we just had COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. But secondly, next slide, Julian. We see a lot of activity regarding new build renewable ammonia capacity. And especially we see a lot of activity, a lot of projects being announced in the Suez Canal economic zone, where a lot of the ammonia is also being developed for export projects. And also Tarek will talk about this later on. And lastly, next slide, please, Julian. Actually, Egypt was the second to last country to actually have renewable ammonia capacity. So in 2019, the Kima plant near the Aswan Dam in the south of Egypt was closed down, but up till 2019, renewable ammonia was actually produced in Egypt. So it shows that this is actually a country where we have some legacy with renewable ammonia capacity. And as already mentioned in the previous slide, we see a lot of activity in the near future, but this time not based on hydropower as it was in the past, but now we expect a lot of activity from solar, but maybe also from wind. And this is what we will discuss today. So next slide, please, Julian. So now I will actually hand over the floor to the first speaker, so that's Alzbeta Klein from the International Fertilizer Association. So Alzbeta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kevin, and good day to everyone. Thank you for this invitation. I'm very excited to participate in this strategic webinar today. As you mentioned, Kevin, we're just back from Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and I can tell you that while it perhaps didn't meet all the expectations that folks had, it actually met quite a lot of expectations. And it met a lot of expectations because two things happened. We started realizing opportunities to decarbonize food value chain through opportunities in ammonia. And we started to focus on decarbonizing on a farm. And those are two bits that really need to be paid attention to, because oftentimes we look at energy systems as its own closed system, but there is a need to look at energy and food at the same time, and through that we need to look at fertilizers, because that's the connecting point between the energy and food prices. So in terms of the takeaways, food systems are clearly on the agenda. Energy opportunities are there, and they need to continue to be there. And there is a possibility to create decarbonization investment opportunities. And that's what I'm going to be talking about a bit. So exactly a year ago, my two colleagues, Lucia Castillo Nieto and Volker Anderson, talked with Peter Levy from the International Energy Agency, IEA, to you about the global ammonia technology roadmap. And today, I would like to show you how IFA is helping fertilizer industry to reach net zero by doing local ammonia roadmaps. We are joking that we are taking roadmaps on the road, literally. And we'll talk about why there are roadmaps at all, and some key takeaways from the global ammonia roadmap and what it means for Egypt. Next slide, please. The International Energy Agency estimated that ammonia production generates around 1.5% of global CO2 emissions and consumes about 2% of global energy resources, making the fertilizer industry one of the hard-to-abate sector. But it's not just hard to abate, because we actually know what needs to be done. It's a sector that's costly to abate, and that's what we are talking about here. On the other hand, mineral fertilizers feed about 40 to 50% of global population every day. And with population growing beyond 8 billion today and going to 10 billion, the role of fertilizers continues to be indispensable to ensure the food security, to ensure availability of fertilizers, but also to ensure affordability of fertilizer in the coming years. Today, the global fertilizer industry is more committed than ever to shift towards sustainable production pathways. So the question is how we are going to go about it. And we definitely cannot change what we don't measure. And that is why over the last 3 years, we partnered with the International Energy Agency, IEA, and the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development to draft an expert-reviewed global ammonia technology roadmap to help ammonia producers transition to net zero by 2050. The aim of this global roadmap was to explore the possible routes to decarbonize nitrogen fertilizer sector, outline the roles and actions of stakeholders, quantify the investment opportunities, look at the policies that governments need to do, and establish milestones for innovation and for deployment. The roadmap was presented at COP26 in Glasgow last year, and it was meant to be used like a little bit of an instruction manual. And I'd love to hear from Tarek whether that actually fulfilled the goal to help local industry develop their own decarbonization pathways. Next slide, please. The global roadmap acknowledges that concerted actions by governments are needed to establish a policy environment which is supportive of the ambitious emissions cuts by creating transition that's underpinned by mandatory emission reduction policies, together with the mechanisms to mobilize investments, foster innovations, and create markets. More efficient fertilizer production and use of plant nutrients can achieve some emission reductions, but the conclusions of the roadmap are very clear. Significant deployment of low carbon technologies is pretty much the only way to still meet the ambitious goals of the Paris Agreement. This massive transition is not going to be cheap. As I mentioned earlier, it is hard to decarbonize, but it's costly to decarbonize. So IEA estimates conservatively that about $14 billion will be needed in capital investments in carbon-free technologies for ammonia production between now and 2050 for the global fertilizer industry to reach net zero by 2050. Now, some of us can look at it as a cost. I would like to look at it as an investment opportunity, as we're going to hear in the second part of this webinar. But what I'd like to mention is that there is not just one decarbonization pathway that will fit every country. Every country has different infrastructure, different access to fuel, different access to renewable energies, different policies. And so the outcome of the global ammonia technology roadmap always needs to be translated into tailored local roadmaps to assess each country's risks, opportunities, and what it takes to decarbonize their own fertilizer industry. And that is where we as an industry need support of financial institutions like the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and others, as EBRD itself was sponsoring global and is now sponsoring the first low carbon pathway for the Egyptian fertilizer industry. Next slide, please. So why Egypt? It is Egypt because it's a major fertilizer producer, it's an exporter, and it's a user of fertilizers. And agriculture is such a critical contributor to the country's economy. But Egypt's fertilizer supply chain is also a substantial contributor to GHG emissions, and these are relatively high compared to the size of the Egyptian economy. On top of this, Egypt's fertilizer industry is exposed to low carbon transition risk and physical climate risks such as climate change, extreme heat, water stress, and others. And addressing all of these can lead to benefits at industrial level and at national level. Now, fortunately, Egypt is one step ahead because the government and the industry are already discussing how to tackle the environmental footprint and what needs to be done to actually deal with the GHG emissions from ammonia production. So EBRD, IFA, and AFA, Arab Fertilizer Association, are working together to develop the first local low-carbon pathway roadmap for the fertilizer industry. This first local roadmap is based on a global ATR, on a global roadmap for Scope 1 and 2, and it will also cover fertilizer use, which is Scope 3 emissions as well. Next slide, please. Part one of this work, the vision of this local roadmap for the fertilizer industry, is essential to Egypt's fulfilling its climate commitments and ambitions while maintaining its competitive position as a fertilizer producer and exporter and supporting a sustainable agriculture sector. The first part of the roadmap was jointly presented at the UN COP in Sharm el-Sheikh during an event which was hosted by the Egyptian government. It concluded that the Egyptian fertilizer supply chain can achieve significant emission savings to 2030 and set itself on a path towards net zero emissions by 2050. Emissions could indicatively decrease by 10 to 20% by 2030 through the implementation of the best available practices, techniques, use of renewable energy, and some early introduction of low carbon technologies. Development of low carbon fertilizer production in the EU may also raise the CBAM carbon benchmark, making it more challenging for Egyptian producers to access and compete in the EU market. However, this risk can be mitigated by the Egyptian fertilizer industry decarbonization alongside that of the European Union, and therefore ensuring that exports continue. The second part, the pathway of this low carbon pathway, is scheduled to be published in mid-2023, and it will focus on translating this vision into an implementable action plan for the industry to achieve its climate goals. Next slide, please. And the local industry is already moving in the right direction, as I am sure Tarek Hosny from Fertiglobe will explain shortly. Local low-carbon ammonia production will soon be a reality. So Egypt is going to be the first country that will have a tailored decarbonization roadmap, which will allow the local industry to work hand in hand with its government, investors, technology providers, and more. And for IFA, this is just the start. Many more countries, especially emerging markets, will need their own tailored decarbonization roadmaps to help them transition to a low-carbon fertilizer production as soon as possible. The European Union and India are likely to be the next regional and local ammonia technology roadmaps, and transition of the nitrogen fertilizer industry to net zero CO2 emissions by 2050 will mitigate around 1.5% of all global CO2 emissions each year through low-carbon production routes that we need to start now. Next slide, please. But we cannot stop at production only. The roadmaps that I just described focus mainly on Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And in the absence of Scope 3 analysis globally, we have developed our own Scope 3 assessment together with Systemic earlier this year to help further reduce emissions on the application side on the farm. So between the global roadmaps on Scope 1 and 2 and Scope 3 emissions on the farm, we can focus not only on calculating the footprint of the industry, but also set the targets. As I mentioned, if you measure it, it's going to get done. And this is why we have teamed up recently with World Business Council on Sustainable Development, WBCSD, to also help them develop sectoral decarbonization approach to help the industry set science-based targets. Next slide, please. So to sum it up, Egypt is the first roadmap that we are going to put on the road. I'm really looking forward to hear the next presenter, Tarek Hosny, to talk about what their company has been doing. But also, I think it will serve as an example to everybody else who is working in the industry to look at what the opportunities are, because the world is not standing still. The technologies are evolving. Government incentives in a number of markets have been evolving. And it's just very exciting to be able to do something very concrete on the ground that provides investment opportunities going forward. So with this, I'd like to pass the mic to you, Kevin, or to Tarek, and then happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alzbeta, and thank you so much for setting the scene and also showing that it's not just either energy or food. It's really the value chain approach where we have to work together and to make sure that the emissions are mitigated along the value chain. We can decarbonize ammonia production, but we also need to make sure that we apply the fertilizers at the right time, in the right quantity, and apply the right fertilizer. So with that, I would like to pass on to Tarek, who will discuss the projects that are actually ongoing at Fertiglobe. Tarek, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin. And Alzbeta, I really enjoyed listening to your presentation. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. It seems like we have people all over the globe. So yeah, very excited to be here with you today. And yeah, if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, great. So basically, just want to give you initially like a very quick introduction to Fertiglobe. Basically, Fertiglobe is the largest ammonia and urea producer in the Middle East. And we are also the largest seaborne exporter in the world, with a global network, leveraging our network and as the network of our shareholders, OCI and ADNOC. Obviously a very big global reach, as you can see on this map. Our products traditionally have been mainly used for fertilizers, as well as in the chemical industry. But as I'll talk to you over the next couple of slides, how this evolved into more, or is expected to evolve, to be used more as a fuel in the near future. And obviously, as a significant market player in the fertilizer industry, we have been, very focused on reducing our carbon footprint through different initiatives. Alzbeta mentioned a few, initiatives and roadmaps that we're also, very eagerly participating in and looking, to set our own targets. But I'll also walk you through some of the other initiatives or projects that we're doing, including the one that we started commissioning during COP. So if you go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So yeah, over the past, as I mentioned, over the past couple of years, as you all kind of have probably sensed, ammonia has gained additional importance. And that's mainly because of, it's a very efficient carrier of hydrogen. And also, as low carbon hydrogen is currently viewed, as the fuel of the future, or, like a very important component to achieving the sustainability goals and the 1.5%, etc. So, on this slide, we're just showing this is just to give an idea. There are different ways to produce ammonia through hydrogen. So the traditional way that's currently used is you get your hydrogen through natural gas or coal, through steam and methane reforming, like an SMR. And basically, during that process, the hydrogen is extracted from the methane, is CH4, and then you're left with the CO2. So there are a lot of companies currently trying to see, okay, how can we traditionally, part of the CO2 actually is used if you have an integrated ammonia urea plant, and you use that CO2 to produce urea, so which is eventually also released to the atmosphere. But that's if it's urea. If it's only ammonia, then you have the CO2 going directly to the atmosphere. So capturing it and then storing it or using it sustainably, depending on the location and as Beta mentioned, each country, each location has its own different challenges and possibilities and opportunities and investment opportunities. So it's really dependent on the location. The other approach is what we call green hydrogen, and this one is based on electrolysis. So in the case of Egypt, there are wind and solar resources, and actually as well as hydro. And as Kevin mentioned, one of the first electrolyzers in Egypt is in Kima, based on hydro. And so in this case, you're getting your hydrogen from water. You're basically separating the H2 from the oxygen from the in the water, and the hydrogen goes then to the ammonia production. So that's obviously there's no CO2 involved in the production at all. So that's the most sustainable way to reach the hydrogen production. Next slide, please. Yeah. So this is just very briefly, I'll talk to you guys about the project that we're doing in Egypt. We're doing it in a partnership with Orascom Construction, the Sovereign Fund of Egypt, SCATIC, and we're co-investors as well in the electrolysis. And our partners are the ones that are developing the renewable energy assets. And Fertiglobe is also the off-taker through its plant in Egypt, EFC. And we then produce the green ammonia and export it, or the plan is going to export it to the different markets. With Europe currently, the demand that we're seeing is currently mostly from Europe in this current phase. So we started commissioning with the first phase. That was during COP. Yeah, Kevin, as you mentioned, that one of the reasons we're talking about Egypt today is because we had COP in Sharm el-Sheikh. And there was a lot of excitement and a lot of other projects that have also been announced still in the initial phases. But many key companies and industry players want to enter this market and want to enter Egypt, which is very, very attractive, for electrolysis and green ammonia production. So and we're currently in the process of finalizing the technology selection for the next phase, and we're expecting FID in October 2023. And just to highlight, here we mentioning here on the slide, first PEM plant was the other plant, the Kima plant was probably ahead of us, and Kevin, as you mentioned, unfortunately has been decommissioned recently. But we're excited, that we took this first step, and hopefully others will follow suit. And thank you, and that's it for my slides. But looking forward to your questions and for the rest of the session. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tarek, and it's great to see that you're making renewable ammonia again in your project, where you work together with EPIC in an existing plant where you feed some green hydrogen. And a question, first of all, to both of you. Actually, when looking at Egypt, what makes Egypt such an interesting place to look at low carbon ammonia? Can be fossil, can be renewable ammonia. Why Egypt? Tarek, can you start?
Why Egypt? Well, I mean, for us, we have our existing assets are in Egypt, Algeria, and the UAE. So for us, it makes sense to start with decarbonizing our existing assets. That's the fastest, in our opinion, the fastest, most efficient way to do it. Egypt, as I mentioned, has access to wind as well as solar energy, which improves basically the utilization of the electrolyzers, because obviously it's intermittent energy, and to be green, depending of course on what the final verdict will be on temporality, how quick you need to use basically this energy from the time it's produced to the time you're actually using it in the electrolysis. So the wind plus solar gives you like a utilization of around 70% or higher, depending obviously on the location of the wind, etc. But if you don't have that, you only have solar, your utilization factors would be below 40%. So that makes a significant difference. So so that makes Egypt really attractive for green ammonia production.
Thank you, Tarek. So Alzbeta, do you see any other aspects here, or what makes Egypt so special?
I'll just build on what Tarek said, because obviously they have the assets there, they're doing it there. But if you look at the concentration of ammonia production and producers, Egypt has a good concentration. So you can have a few companies that can learn from each other and really create a cluster, potentially, led by Fertiglobe and others. The other thing is that with the investments in renewable energy, like the Benban project, the large solar project that Egypt invested in, there has been a substantial investments there, and hopefully those will continue. So there are opportunities to build on that as well. So I think Egypt has unique opportunity because it has the industrial cluster, and it already started on the renewable energy investments as well. So it makes quite a lot of sense to start there.
Thank you so much. And I got a question from Dolf Gielen from the World Bank, who says there are about 25, but at least there are tens of green hydrogen and renewable ammonia projects being proposed in Egypt. And his question is basically, how are these actually typically financed? So are there any specific circumstances in Egypt that make financing great? Tarek, can you comment?
Yeah, sure, I can comment on that. So yeah, usually these projects are financed through basically project finance, so ring-fenced financing. And the idea here is that you would, you need obviously access to the supply. So in this case, supply is the renewable energy, which makes things obviously much simpler. But then you also need, if you're looking, depending on the project, if it's just a hydrogen project, then you would need an ammonia off-taker, right? If it's a full kind of project going all the way from renewables to the green ammonia, then you would need, in this case, you would need the green ammonia off-takers. If it's only hydrogen, you need the green hydrogen off-takers. So people like us, they will take the hydrogen and produce the ammonia. So the challenge here is, it's obviously these projects also, to get the lowest price possible, need to have the longest tenor. So get the best financing, you need above plus 15 years. Of course, I've seen that quite well. So usually that would have to be coupled with a long-term offtake agreement. So whether it's the hydrogen or the ammonia, and then it needs to reach an end customer. And say for us as Fertiglobe, once we buy the hydrogen, produce the ammonia, obviously having this hydrogen offtake for 20 years means we also need to have customers to sell to for 20 years. And that's really where the challenge lies. The demand is currently, you might find demand for small quantities for a year or two, but to ask someone to take on product for 20 years is quite a challenge, especially currently there's still uncertainty on certification, whether product will be classified as green or not. You meet the requirements in Europe, about Asia, etc. So it's still very fluid, while at the same time you expect the company that's raising the financing to have these long-term offtake agreements.
Thank you so much. And you touched upon a lot of aspects already, long-term agreements versus insecurity. So what are the markets actually going to do? So Alzbeta, are there any specifics in Egypt that make it work, or are there any risks from other locations? Can you elaborate?
I think it was best covered by Tarek. I don't think I can add much to it. I think we have seen here on the chat some of the technical questions and some of the questions on water and a few other things. So I don't know if Tarek wants to take that, but I think the critical piece is to have the industrial cluster, availability of financing, availability of investments, and the government policies that support it. And I think we are in a sort of sweet spot in Egypt, provided the financing comes. I haven't seen any details on where the financing has been coming from to answer the question from the World Bank. But I think some combination of development finance institutions and commercial banks and export credit agencies probably are going to be assembled for everybody else who is going to go in that route. I don't know, Tarek, what do you think?
Yeah, no, good point. So I guess, in terms of financing, a country like Egypt, would get, attention from DFIs like the World Bank, EBRD, IFC, etc. So that could also be supporting the projects, because also, when you're in these initial phases of the technology maturity, market maturity, etc., you really need a lot of support to be able to get to a price, a hydrogen price, and subsequently an ammonia price that's acceptable to the end users. So obviously, the more support these projects can get, the more likely they are to get off the ground. Whereas if you're doing projects, as an example, in the UAE, where we also have assets, it's obviously harder to get some of that development financing.
Yes.
And as Beta also mentioned, we already have existing solar, wind projects, so you have these capabilities in terms of developing such projects, etc.
Yes, you're totally right. And the nice thing indeed in Egypt is that you already have capacity for producing ammonia, and the part that's not going to urea is probably low-hanging fruit to decarbonize. A question for Alzbeta in this context. If you look globally, there is quite some movement in the market. For instance, in Europe, there's this ETS system where you also have CBAM coming up. Whereas in other locations, such as in the US, you now kind of have a subsidy scheme for low carbon hydrogen projects. Canada just announced some subsidy schemes. So, Alzbeta, are there any risks for Egypt as a producer to actually compete in the market?
It's a great question, because what we are seeing on one part is subsidies are coming in, especially for blue hydrogen, blue ammonia, such as in the United States. And that is making them very, very competitive. We are seeing other countries that are coming up with ideas on how to support the industries. A priori, I would say that the need is such that a subsidy in the US or a subsidy in Canada is not going to fundamentally distort the global market, just because the needs are huge. I mean, the needs to decarbonize the industry are in every corner of the world. So the question becomes, how quickly that shift will happen, and how quickly the final customer will be demanding that certain part of their fertilizer or industrial use ammonia, as the case may be, comes from either from a renewable source or where the carbon is sequestered. So I think you need to think about this demand side, not just the supply side. Supply is starting to come as we are seeing the announcements, and at IFA we are tracking all the projects that are being announced, and there is plenty of them, as you know, around the world. But I think first movers will have an advantage, and the first movers hopefully will be able to lock in the demand side, so where the customer is asking for this kind of product. And I think this is going to be critical, because we can produce a lot, but if the customer is not interested, it's going to be difficult. But I think customers are interested, and the project that Tarek was talking about is just one of the few that is happening in real life. A lot of them are announced; they need to happen. But so far, the volume is so small that I'm not seeing too many risks to projects that are actually getting done.
I think you're totally right, Alzbeta, and you're also right in the sense that a lot of projects have been announced, and we also keep a list of all the announced projects, and the line items. There are like 200 line items, but at the moment we really see projects with maybe 20 megawatt in that size range of electrolyzers. And I think in that sense, the project in Fertiglobe is already quite big. Out of my head, it's like 90 megawatt of electrolyzers. When thinking about this project, Tarek, seeing the global movement on the subsidy schemes, is this a risk for FID, or don't you see it in this global context?
Yeah, no. Obviously, we are monitoring the situation in the US very, very closely. We mentioned you mentioned the 45 cube. In this case, that's more when you get credits, $85 per ton of CO2 that's captured and sequestered. So that comes out to quite a significant figure. So with that type of incentive, you can be basically bringing in blue ammonia into Europe for a cost that's much lower than what we could bring in from Egypt. Even if it's green, but the difference in the CO2 kind of emissions between the two products, doesn't really justify this big gap that you see. And for the green products in the US, you get a $3 per kilogram tax incentive, so that's quite significant. In this case, the green cost would be quite small. So again, comparing that to green coming from Egypt. Would be kind of quite at a disadvantage. So we definitely do see a threat. We've seen specifically, I know you see a lot of these projects, as you mentioned, like line items, etc., of a big list, but for the blue specifically, we've seen a lot of projects FID in the US. And yes, of course, there will be some, the demand is still growing, but we also don't see kind of a matching, say, incentives from the demand side, like say for contracts for difference, or even regulation-wise that kind of put like more put pressure on the demand side, basically, to take in some of the product.
So you have kind of a unique position in the sense that you're both involved in the production side and also in the offtake side, in the trading of the ammonia. So over the past 12, maybe 24 months, have you seen any change with regards to the willingness to actually buy renewable ammonia or other low carbon ammonia at a cost premium versus maybe 2 years ago?
Yes, definitely. Versus 2 years ago, there is more willingness, but as I mentioned, earlier, it's going to be more for small quantities, for 1 shipment, 2 shipments. If you want to go for something long term, maybe like for a year, but getting something above that duration is quite challenging at the moment.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially because, for instance, the shipping sector will only be fully introduced in the ETS system in Europe in 2026. So before that, there's probably limited long-term demand for the shipping sector in Europe. So we have to wait for that indeed. So also looking at other markets. So right now, you talked mostly about Europe. Is there any other specific market that's demanding the low carbon ammonia from Egypt, or is it mainly focused on Europe?
No, we're monitoring other markets. You have Asia as well, where it's mostly used in power generation. So we're looking at that as well. The usage as a marine fuel still kind of being developed still, but yeah. So we're looking at a few different markets, but yeah, in summary, like they're still being developed, still a lot of uncertainty, and no one is looking more to the longer term, short term kind of at the moment.
All right, so thank you for that. And now I want to move actually to a completely different topic, so towards urea. So Alzbeta, in your slides, you mentioned that Egypt is one of the biggest urea producers and one of the biggest urea exporters. So do you expect a kind of a shift away from urea in general and also specifically from Egypt, or is urea to stay? So what's kind of the dynamic that you expect towards a decarbonized world?
That's a great question and a big investment question. So look, we know the upsides and downsides of urea, right? It is still one of the richest fertilizer available, and we know its environmental footprint. Having looked at farmers worldwide, farmers are probably going to stay with urea for the time being. And even though we need to decarbonize the whole value chain, I am a realistic, pragmatic person, which means that I think urea is here to stay for a little bit longer. It's going to depend on a couple of factors. One, how quickly we can really decarbonize the nitrogen value chain. And the second one, how we can educate farmers. Farmers are a very traditional bunch, and they like what they like, and they like the products that have delivered to them. And I think the two need to go hand in hand. As I mentioned in my initial presentation, we need to work in the factory and we need to work at the farm. I think that balance is going to be a very fine balance going forward. But for the foreseeable future, it is here to stay, whether we like it or not. And I think the onus is on companies that have retail networks to the farmers to continue educating farmers on various fertilizers, on novel fertilizers, on what are the new technologies. And then the other thing we need to do is make sure that farmers help educate each other, because farmers trust other farmers. If another farmer uses something that is new and brings him the results while also having lower carbon footprint, the farmers will listen to that person because they are credible within their community. So we need to build up the whole ecosystem around how we bring in new technologies on the farm and what needs to happen there. So again, we need to look both at the supply and demand, but the short answer, we understand the environmental footprint of urea, and we do believe that it's here with us for the time being.
Thank you so much, and also for sharing the insight that it's not only a technology thing or not only an economics thing, it's also a societal thing where farmers actually need to trust did this fertilizer. To give an example from long ago, there were all these different fertilizers being developed in the early 20th century. And in Germany, they developed this calcium cyanamide process, the Francaro process. And these fertilizers, they were black in their appearance. And actually in Japan, they wouldn't use this fertilizer because it looks kind of dirty, so they didn't want to use it because it looked like coal. So it really showed that it's also a matter of what do people actually want to use, and yeah, this is very relevant as well. So Tarek, what's your opinion? Will urea be part of your mix in the coming foreseeable future and also long term? Is there maybe a way to decarbonize urea production?
Yeah, so yeah, good question. And so as Alzbeta mentioned in her slides, there was one of those slides that showed that 50 to 80% of the greenhouse gas emissions are actually come after you apply the fertilizer, and that's really an area where we see a lot of potential through inhibitors, where you can actually slow down, I guess, the intake of the fertilizers, and actually the actual nitrogen goes to the plants. And as Beta mentioned, the farmer, they need to see value, right? You won't just tell them like it's good for the environment. So the plants can intake the nutrients better, and that means savings, that means higher yield, etc. So yeah, the focus, what we're looking at now is different technologies also in terms of inhibitors, etc. But also currently, at the end of the day, it takes time also for let's say for the farmer to realize, okay, these are actually have a financial value. Some of them might not be able to take that risk to try, if actually works or not. But also, I think there are no current incentives as well to incentivize, paying TCS. Maybe it would cost like an additional $25 to $40 in a premium to get these products.
I think you're totally right, and the only way, most likely, that this will actually happen, that farmers will use different fertilizers, if there's a mandate across the value chain to have a fully decarbonized product, and then you have to qualify by using decarbonized fertilizers. Can be decarbonized urea, can be decarbonized, can be other fertilizers, right? And now I actually want to focus a bit also on your project, Egypt Green. In this project, you selected PEM electrolyzers, whereas historically every electrolyzer was an alkaline electrolyzer, and now we see multiple technologies coming up. Alkaline is a very mature technology. PEM is also commercial at a similar scale at the moment. You also have new technologies coming up like solid oxides. What is the reason for now choosing for a PEM electrolyzer in this facility, and do you foresee a kind of shift in technologies? So Tarek?
No, so one of the benefits of PEM is also that the output pressure, the hydrogen output pressure, was worked basically for us in terms of the intake into our ammonia plant. So that was very important. It didn't require a compressor, etc., which is a long lead item as well. So that was a big selling point for us, at least for this first phase. But also with PEM, again, this is all new technology, but the expectation is that it also works better with intermittent electricity based on renewables. So shutdown time, ramp up time, etc., is faster than with the alkaline. However, if that's specifically important if you're connected directly to your renewable energy assets. So the solar plant is directly connected to the hydrogen plant. If you're connected to the grid, that benefit doesn't become as big, because at the end of the day, you're using the grid, to basically banking on the grid. So if let's say the sun sets, you can still, continue running your electrolyzer for a few minutes just to stable it down, or if you have wind, that's back and forth. So it's that benefit becomes smaller when you're connected to the grid. Also, other factors that impact that is, I mentioned temporality requirements. Can it be 50? Is it within 15 minutes, or is it within the whole month? Which is regulations, I guess, from the end customer, but will also have to be kind of coordinated with the grid operator, right? Because even if the European regulations, as an example, tell you can use a full month, kind of to balance it out, and the local grid operators, as you know, like you can't put any excess energy now on my grid and take it later. So it's just this balancing act. But yeah, in general, that was our thinking in terms of the PEM. And to be frank, the part with the balancing on the grid, we hadn't realized that earlier.
Very good to know that. And in general, projects that are being developed in Egypt, are they generally somewhat connected to the grid, so where there's also some hydropower available, or do you really see islanded systems in the short term?
No, I believe they will all be connected to the grid, because you're getting your solar from some locations and wind from others, so it won't be practical to connect both directly.
Thank you for that. So
directly, what I mean by directly is that you're connecting through not the national grid net. It's just a separate, independent connection from the asset to the plant.
Yeah, totally right. And also in other locations in the world, we see similar developments where there's still a little bit of connection to a grid in order to have a base load, whereas most of the electricity will come from solar or from wind. So, for example, in Spain, there's this plant from Fertiglobe, which is also connected to the grid, although it gets most of its power from renewables. So Alzbeta, looking more on a global level, the projects being announced, is this similar to what you see in the global project list?
Yeah, absolutely. Egypt is a great example and shows the precondition, but yeah, the global project list is pretty much echoes what we are seeing in Egypt.
Maybe also a question, also sneaking a little bit into the publication that you will have in 2023 on Egypt. So do you mainly see electrolysis as a decarbonizing technology in Egypt, or do you also expect other technologies to play a key role to decarbonize the fertilizer sector?
Yeah, I saw a few questions on a chat on nuclear and a few others. I'm afraid I won't be able to comment at this time because we are still in the middle of the work to make it happen. But look, I think given that the world is going through a major energy crisis at the moment, I think we need to really consider all options that are available for any country. But as I mentioned at the beginning, it's going to be targeted, it's going to be tailored towards country conditions. So unfortunately, can't comment in more detail on this yet, but given what's happening around us, we need to be very conscious of all the possible sources available to us.
Okay, thank you for that. And I guess we have to wait for a few months, but
give us a few more months.
It will be a very good report in the end. Maybe one other aspect that you can comment about, maybe focused on Egypt, but also more globally. So even if a renewable project is technically and economically feasible, are there any general roadblocks that you can still see then?
Look, I think the biggest issue for any company in today's world is permitting that the governments need to make faster and more efficient. I don't know what Tarek and his colleagues think at Fertiglobe about that, but we are seeing it across a number of jurisdictions where it takes a very long time to get approvals for plants of any type, even the renewable one, even the blue, all of them. So when I was coming out of Sharm el-Sheikh, I really had this feeling that we cannot wait. We don't have a luxury to wait because our farmers are telling us that they had drought. Pakistan Minister of Environment talked very, empathically about what was happening in Pakistan in terms of climate. I don't think we have time to wait. So we need to basically roll out the technologies as they come, and we should not take 10, 15 years to permit anything. We should be very quick, do the due diligence, do the proper due diligence, and allow companies to invest, allow banks to finance these projects. But we just don't have a luxury of time because climate change is happening on a farm as we speak. Just ask any farmer. And so we need to do as much as possible in decarbonizing our value chain. And I think that will be the key message to policymakers from this dialogue.
Yeah, I think you're totally right, Alzbeta. In principle, the technology is there. We have these solar panels. We have the wind turbines. And we know that an electrolyzer can have some fluctuations, and maybe the ammonia plant cannot be shut down every day. But you know, we have a grid connection, so that could work as well. So Tarek, are there any roadblocks for the projects apart from the techno-economics? If you look at Egypt and maybe also some other projects that you're working on?
I wouldn't say roadblocks, but I'll just say there's, in general, uncertainty that makes it difficult to develop projects. So, you know, you have a few, let's say the technological uncertainty exists, but I think the bigger one is also the market, as I mentioned earlier, market uncertainty. What's happening elsewhere in the world in terms of competing products, but also on the demand side, on the certification and regulations. You know, we see, you know, in Europe, the regulations were very stringent, and now maybe are getting more relaxed, and let's say maybe, in my opinion, more practical. But still, nothing is kind of firm, right? So we're still kind of not sure, you know, where it's going to land. It's not just us, but it's also whoever would buy the green ammonia. So this uncertainty is just is what makes it a little bit tough for us, but also for any other projects that are coming online.
So if I hear correctly, if I rephrase, what you're looking for is clarity on the long term, and also transparency to know what needs to be in place and what are the rules in the specific location. Is that right?
Yes, correct. Like a big challenge for us actually is, I mentioned also, we're focusing on decarbonizing our existing assets. So one of what we think is a good step also is the carbon border adjustment mechanism in Europe, which would be, you know, penalizing products that have imported products that have for their carbon footprint. So for us, we think, okay, we'll have a stream, or part of our assets, you know, are taking green hydrogen, so therefore we can export green ammonia and not be subject to this tax. But then there's some discussion still now of, you know, will such a model work or not? If you go like a mass balancing, will this be allowed? Will our product be seen as 10% green and 90% gray, or will it kind of be saying, okay, no, everything you're producing is just has a 10% lower footprint, and therefore you might not even be eligible, you know, to for any of these tax incentives. So that's the challenge, another challenge that we're facing. So again, a lot of uncertainty, and hopefully things would go, you know, in the direction that we think is more realistic to achieve the carbon reduction goals for the entire world.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And also you mentioned mass balancing here, and it can go even further. It can even be, if it's allowed, it can even be book and claim, which could basically mean you produce a low carbon fertilizer locally, but the farmer is not willing to pay, whereas somebody elsewhere uses ammonia for power applications, and that person maybe buys the certificate. So that could even happen, but it really depends on what legislations will accept. And that's, at the moment, it's very uncertain. A lot of organizations are currently developing green hydrogen certification, and also even green ammonia certification, or low carbon ammonia certification, among them the Ammonia Energy Association. So Alzbeta, just wondering, because you're more looking from the fertilizer perspective, is there a clear appetite from the fertilizer side of ammonia to have certification, or is this more a ammonia energy discussion?
No, there's definitely a demand to do it on our side as well. And I think the faster we get it done, the better it will be. So yeah, absolutely, we would like to see it happen. And obviously there are other applications of ammonia that probably will look for the same thing.
All right, so that's very good to hear. It's not just the energy sector that needs to decarbonize, it's definitely also the food sector. Totally right. Now let's look a bit forward, because right now we are still in the exploratory phase, where we have the first projects getting off the ground and producing the first drops of renewable hydrogen for ammonia. But let's say, Alzbeta, we are now 5 to 10 years from now. In an ideal scenario, what has EVA achieved and what has been realized?
So that would be a good wrap up to end with. I think a couple of things. If I look at 2030 and the vision towards 2050, a couple of things emerging. One, when it comes to ammonia, we will have a clear pathways in key producing countries and not only pathways, but actually projects that are being done and that have been done already. So that's very short time. It's only 8 years from now, but we will have done quite a bit. And then towards 2050, we can look towards net zero, which means that a lot of ammonia will be decarbonized through the roadmaps. And whatever is not decarbonized in a factory, because there will still be some leftover projects that are not fully decarbonized, will be actually compensated with carbon sequestration and many other technologies that are available for farmers on the farm. And ultimately, I would like to see a farmer being compensated not only for the product that they produce, but for the soil that they leave behind. And that means that they'll have a clear incentive to choose the fertilizer and apply a fertilizer that has characteristics that allow him or her to claim that better soil health afterwards. So that's for the wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I totally agree with you. And maybe in 10 years, we have best available technology also for decarbonized production, where we know how to operate a fluctuating renewable ammonia plant, and we know what's the best way to do that. So Tarek, from your perspective, if we now look like 5 to 10 years into the future, what is the ideal scenario for Fertiglobe? How, like, are you shipping renewable ammonia all around the globe, or what do we see happen?
Yeah, so ideally, probably closer to 10 years that we'd have decarbonized, most of our existing asset base. But we're also currently developing or co-developing a project in the UAE that's, as Alzbeta mentioned, like kind of, in this case, capturing the CO2 and using it instead of just, instead of going to the atmosphere. So this is the direction, that we want to be moving in. And yes, ideally, we would be able to decarbonizing the entire asset base. Also means, having this acceptance by the market in terms of the fertilizers as well, because that's traditionally our business. So yes, in addition, growing maybe in fuels, but fertilizers is our core. So yeah, hopefully we can be also selling our products and for a premium and kind of helping reduce the carbon footprint.
Thank you so much, and definitely I agree with you. It's not only the ammonia for energy, but also the fertilizers. If you can decarbonize both, that will be the end goal indeed. So with that, I think we had two very nice closing statements on the near future, and I want to thank both of you for that. So both Alzbeta and Tarek, thank you for hanging on with me for the entire hour, and thank you to the audience for listening. And this actually wraps up the final webinar on ammonia projects in 2022, but actually in 2023 we will be back with a new series of webinars. So with that, I would like to thank one more time Alzbeta and Tarek. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.